to A Shamanic Experience. I'm Katie Weatherup, shamanic practitioner and solo traveler. If you believe mountains hold ancient wisdom and rivers cleanse, you're in the right place. Let's explore the energy and magic of places near and far, and I'll share practical travel tips along the way, one sacred location at a time. Of all the magnificent trees I've had the opportunity to meet so far, my absolute favorite resides in Nelder Grove, just south of Yosemite. And in my travels, I've met some pretty cool trees. There's a magnificent banyan tree near Akaka Falls on the Big Island of Hawaii that is particularly magnificent, and I dearly love the bristlecone pines up in the Lone Pine area up above Death Valley. But this one particular giant sequoia in the grove stood out to me above and beyond the other experiences I've had, so much so that I made a print of one of the photographs I took in order to allow me to connect with the energy, because it was such a key and important reminder and lesson for me. The particular tree that I fell in love with is estimated to be 2,700 years old, meaning that this was already a very old tree when the Mayflower first made landing on the East Coast. And one of the things that I loved about this experience, I think that, in Yosemite and Kings Canyon, there are some of the largest trees in the world, some of the not the oldest, because the bristlecone pine are older, but some very old, very giant sequoias that have their own epic presence. And one of the things that I particularly loved about being in Nelder Grove, away from all the, children being wrangled to walk on the path and people laughing and talking and discussing what was for dinner, and just having a silence and a solitude to have the experience, is I really felt the threshold of when I crossed over into the energetic area of this particular tree. And it really has that feel of a contrast and an energy change. So for many years, I maintained a healing space where I did all of my work that was separate from my home. And it was a dedicated space. We were coming together to learn shamanic journey or for me to provide healing sessions. And as a result, this, a little bit rundown kind of industrial complex that housed this had a very different and very contrasting energetic experience than when you cross the threshold into this energetically protected space. When I visited Europe and stepped into cathedrals, there's this sort of change in the energy, because this is a place that has a lot of people shifting out of sort of the ordinary what's for dinner and coming into a different alignment, even though I don't particularly resonate with the framework of Christianity as my spirituality. The faith and engagement and the beauty and the lines of the building really have a palpable change in the experience when you step in. And that's the most similar, stepping into an ancient cathedral in, the city of Wells in England, is very similar in some ways to the experience of when I crossed a particular threshold well out of line of sight from the tree and suddenly felt the energy change into something charged with the energy of the sacred, is probably the best way I can put it into words. And so the la la la, walking through the pretty forest, how happy to ooh, wow, was a very distinct shift for me. And then it amplified and increased as I got closer. And I sometimes sort of wish that I loved forests more. I think they're really beautiful. I enjoy walking through them, but I tend a lot more toward rocks and mountains as far as sources of power, until we get into the really old trees. And there's such a difference from younger trees, which are nifty and cool, and this ancient tree that had been being a tree on the planet for such a incredible amount of time. So much of what we have as recorded history, this tree was hanging out on this place on the planet reaching up to the stars, taller than anything around it, having its, unique experience. And my guides enlisted the aid of this particular magnificent tree and one of its brethren for a teaching experience for me. And they were talking about it being a model of be like the tree in terms of an antidote to codependency. So if you go over to my main podcast, the Practical Shamanism podcast, one of the episodes I have is on the concept of codependency, because energetically sensitive people are more vulnerable to it, and it can have different components. And for me, carrying the archetype of the healer, that archetype needs a lot of adult supervision, not to create a lot of havoc by overgiving and, neglecting other aspects of life and such. It's just a very strong aspect of me that I need to keep in balance with the rest of me. And so having this psychic ability that can give me information about people that I'm connected to, and knowing intuitively when someone's hurting and struggling, no matter what front they're presenting. And I'm very boundaried about not deliberately looking at people without permission, but there's always something that kind of, seeps through unless I'm really disengaged. So I'm probably not picking up too much from people at the grocery store. But once I'm in rapport with someone I care about, I'm really feeling what's going on, and I can get very invested in their good and their outcomes to the point of really neglecting being in my own lane and being up to what I should be up to. And this can apply in the, individual friends, and it can also apply to social causes. And there's a complicated conversation about being good citizens of the world and at the same time being in our own lane and what that balance is. But I've tended to tip into leaving myself and what I'm up to in suffering over others' suffering or getting caught up in that. And at the time that I visited this magnificent tree, that was very much in play for me. And the guides were just really showing me the model and the energy and the experience of this tree that is completely interconnected in the ecosystem of everything around it. It's shading the forest floor. There, things growing in the roots. There's, all of this, the deep roots are pulling up nutrients, and it's part of this ecosystem, completely integrated, but also completely in its own business of just doing its own experience. And I was shown sort of time lapse that fires had come through and droughts, and there are these individual magnificent sequoia trees that are so large and so old. They're a bit thin on the ground, even in the place that has the greatest density of them. And they alone stood and watched the rise and fall of many forests, fire coming through that these trees survived, and droughts, and humans making messes, and all of the things. And that's very rare. Most trees have a much shorter life cycle. They don't grow as large, and they don't have this richness of history. And so finding this unique being, I was kind of asking it its secrets, and it was saying, well, I had really good tree DNA, like very nice, robust. I came from a really good seed, and this feeling of just being so committed to its own life principle. So part of the view of shamanism is that everything has spirit, and you can talk to the spirit and essence of things if you know how. And what was shared with me from the tree essence, it wasn't trying to give or provide. It was just so in this energetic principle that had this epic energy bubble around it that was created, and this opportunity for other things to live. But this tree really had consistently over all these many, many years stayed in its own life force principle. And there was good in it for all these other beings that, grew up in the shadow of this tree and had these experiences. And I just thought that was such a powerful image as a touchstone of something to come back to, of coming back to being in my own lane, being in my own center. And trees are a really good metaphor also, especially for energetically sensitive people. A lot of times we have way more active upper chakras than lower chakras. And even when you look at the tree of life representation, a lot of times the branches are shown as larger than the roots. It's a little bit rare for the roots and branches to be shown equal size. And what we know about really successful long-lived trees is they have this epic root system underground. Otherwise, they're very vulnerable to tipping over. And so this concept and invitation is to really put your roots in the ground as a sensitive person and ground downward and connect to the earth as much as you connect up to source. A lot of people I see, their energy bodies are kind of like a funnel. They have these big, wide open, crown chakras and these little spindly roots. And it just makes it hard to embody our full power and passion and effectiveness in the world when we aren't rooting into the physical. And it can be tricksy, and we can end up having feelings we, don't necessarily want to work with. And, there's complexity to this. But for me, that reminder of that sort of be the energetic model of the tree, put my roots in the ground, connection to source, stand tall in middle world, and have this experience that's centered in my own experience in a way that there's good in it for others. Ideally, the ripple out from me has really good things that happen for other people, ways that they can feel supported, and these aligned energy exchanges that are win-wins. But at the core, when I start to sort of drift into worrying about someone who I'm not even interacting with at that particular moment, or ruminating or trying to solve their problems when I haven't been invited, that coming home to that principle of being incredibly present. The tree felt very, very present with the forest around it, but also so centered in its own individual experience that had spanned a amount of time that's very, very hard for the human brain to wrap itself around. So you may have noticed I didn't tell you what particular tree, and part of that is the guides say, the tree that most talks to you, that most has the magic, that being on the planet for all this time with all of this expression might be a completely different tree. And they don't want me to mention this one particularly because it could take you away from the sort of beginner's mind and the clarity of just feeling the tree that calls to you. Years ago, I did a retreat. I was attending as a student, not the teacher. But one of the exercises was to go out and just walk in the forest and find a tree that wanted to talk to you, that had wisdom, and, to have this deeper communion and relationship and conversation. And I've done that, in the workshop, but also a number of times on my own. And I think it's an excellent thing to get up to, and can be done any place with trees around. But particularly if you're seeking out some of these really ancient trees, it can be really, really useful. And one of the things I found really interesting, I talk about the bristlecone pines that get so ancient, they can live up to like 10,000 years. And I really enjoyed sort of walking among the bristlecone pines. They live at very high altitudes, so there's already kind of a trancy feeling to them. But they have this still contained energy that's mystical and very cool, whereas my experience of these giant sequoias is they really create a massive energy field that can be experienced. There's sort of a outflow of energy. You may have experienced this with like a very large crystal where you're like, wow, there's a lot of power coming off this thing. And similarly, there's a very magnificent presence that can be played in related to these trees. And the dynamic nature of the energy is something that is particularly cool. So I hope that you have a chance to go there. Nelder Grove is just a little bit south of Yosemite, and it's one of those spots where, it's a little harder to get to. There's some dirt roads involved, but you can have this experience of getting to drop in with just the trees and the forest and maybe a hiker or two or a group that, comes and goes. But there's so much more opportunity where the loudest voice in the conversation can be that of the trees, because you're not tuning out these other humans who are having a completely valid, national park experience, just perhaps not the one that you would prefer to be having. Thank you so much for joining me. To learn more about me and my work, please visit my website at handsoverheart.com. There you can join my mailing list for access to free bonus content in the members-only area. If you've enjoyed this, please consider subscribing and leaving a review. It would help me out a lot. If you'd like to receive personal shamanic support from me and my team of guides, please consider joining my Patreon community. You'll find the link below. And again, thank you so much for listening. This is Katie Weatherup, wishing you wholeness and happiness.